morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest of the TAC webinars and information sessions, which are, those of you that have been participating in them will know that these have been going for some time and are extremely useful for the RTOs that are being managed by TAC. A very warm welcome, well, a chilly welcome from New South Wales. I'm actually based over near Canberra, so we've actually been having very, very cold mornings. I think it was down to -6, so I envy those of you, particularly those who are signing in from up in Broome and nice areas north. So think of me freezing here in New South Wales. Anyway, to get on with the webinar today, just before I go on to to actually start the process, I just want to double check that you've all got your documentation that was submitted to you when you registered for this webinar. So you should have a couple of things. One is a handout, which is preparing for audit handout, which really is a summary of what I'm talking about today, but also the very useful information that you will find on the TAC website. Some of you, if you're like me, you like a hard copy, so it's quite useful if you are a hard copy person to use that document to flag any of the issues that you think are particularly relevant to you, and it's always a great reference document. There are also a couple of documents about that support and explain how TAC actually goes about their regulatory functions, which include the TAC risk framework and the TAC annual regulatory strategy for 2019 to 2021. You should have a copy of those, and then you'll also have been sent 3 of the very, very useful TAC fact sheets. These have been developed over the last few years by some of the auditors and also the staff at TAC, and I think they are probably the benchmark for how to support the RTOs that are trying to meet the requirements of the regulator, and I think they are very clear and concise and can assist you. The ones that are particularly pertinent today are the fact sheet on assuring quality. There's also one on record management, and then there's one on managing non-compliance against the standards for RTOs. Finally, you should have got an example of an audit report. Some of you will have already been through the audit process with TAC and received a new format audit report. Others may still have to have that pleasure. It's a very lengthy document, but it does, once you learn how to look at them correctly, you should be able to work out exactly what the outcome of any audit that you've participated in, how that was derived and the decisions were made and the evidence that was reviewed. Okay, so let's get on with the actual presentation. Oh, before I move on, I just want to also say, obviously there are a huge number of you today, which is fantastic, and I'm more than happy if people have got some questions to pop them in the chat box. I'll try and get to them as we go along if they are relevant to what I'm talking about. If I know they're going to be answered a bit further down the track, I probably won't necessarily address them straight away, but there is also an opportunity for question and answers at the at the end of or partway through the presentation, so you can just, if you've got any questions, just drop them down and I'll try and get through them as I work through the presentation, if that's possible. If not, we'll take questions at the end. Okay, so really today's session is going to be focused mainly on preparing for an audit and giving you an understanding of why TAC audit, but also then how they go about it and how you can make yourself best prepared for an audit that will allow you to showcase how well you run and manage your registered training organisation, and also how you deliver quality training and assessment. I think the main thing I would like you to take away from this particular presentation is that audits should not be scary. They should be seen as something which is adds value to your organisation, and TAC pays particular attention to that, and we as the auditors that the audit for TAC are constantly reminded that our role is not just to nitpick and find issues. In fact, that's not our role at all. It's very much a case of trying to get a clear picture of what an organisation is, how they're running and how they're delivering the training and assessment that they are offering, and how we can then support you as an organisation to continuously improve what you're offering, and also to identify areas, if there are areas of non-compliance, and then give you guidance on how those can be rectified. It's really interesting that the feedback that TAC gets after audits is usually very, very positive. So about 80% of the respondents after they've had an audit say that it was a worthwhile experience, and in the last financial year, 100% of the audit, the RTOs that were audited agreed that the audit actually added value to their organisation. And that's really the attitude I would hope you would want to be taking to when it comes to having an audit run by one of the TAC auditors. It should be seen as a positive activity, and hopefully if there are some issues, then it will be clearly indicated as to how those can be addressed, and you should come away from the experience feeling that you've got that there's value has been added to your organisation. So these are the topics that we're going to be looking at today. Really the main focus is on the first part, which is understanding why TAC audits RTOs and how that fits in with their strategy, what to expect before you are participate in a TAC audit, and then how to prepare for a desk audit and a site audit. If we've got enough time at the end of towards the end of the presentation, I will also look briefly at what happens during a site audit, and what happens after the audit, and what happens next once you have been audited and everything is finished. Those last 3 points will be dependent on very much on how much feedback I'm getting from you and how many discussions we have or questions you have. So the focus really is on the four first sections of this particular activity. And again, what I want you to take away from this is that you should not be fearing an audit. If you are going to be participating in an audit soon, try to think of it as a positive experience, and that will allow you much more opportunity to truly showcase what you do as an organisation. Okay, don't think there's anything on the questions yet. Good. Sorry about that. Those of you that are having a few issues with the sound, do let me know if I can do anything about it. Okay, so let's get started on the first topic, which is understanding the audit process. Like with everything, even when you're training and assessing, the first thing you do is you put things into context. So really, what this little section is about is putting the audit process into context, specifically in relation to why TAC audits the registered training organisations for which they have responsibility. Also, like any good training session, you want to define what you're actually going to be talking about, and so I think it's really a good idea to just take a couple of seconds to think about what an audit really is. There are lots of definitions. Some come with quality systems, etc., but basically all of the definitions of an audit have a certain number of themes going through them which are common. So an audit is a systematic, independent and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. Now that is a generic description of audits which are conducted across in all sorts of spheres, but excuse me. In the case of the audits conducted in the vet space, the audit criteria I'm sure you can work out what those would be. That is basically your standards for RTOs 2015 and a number of the aspects of the vet quality framework, including the AQF, etc. So there are some very, very clear audit criteria. And those are the audit criteria that every TAC auditor is familiar with, and you as an organisation should be familiar with, because that's where your focus when it comes to compliance should be. The audit evidence, which the TAC auditor is looking at and using to make decisions in terms of, at the level of compliance of the organisation they're auditing, can be varied as the different organisations that we audit. Make no mistake, there are no real no two RTOs that are truly exactly the same. Each auditor has come across multiple different variations on a theme, and that's what makes our job so interesting, because there is no prescriptive right and wrong way of doing things. What you have to do is meet the requirements of the standards and the vet quality framework, but how you do that is really open to interpretation, and that's what makes our job very interesting. But generally, the documentation that the evidence that we look at is documentation of all sorts, whether that's hard copy or electronic copy. We also can look at things like emails, websites. We conduct interviews if it's a site audit. So there's lots and lots of ways that you as an RTO can provide evidence of how you meet the requirements of the standards, but there's also lots of ways in which we, as an auditor, we can actually look at gather the evidence from you to say yes, you are meeting the requirements. So lots of different ways. So TAC is the regulator for Western Australia, the vet regulator for Western Australia, and they have a very specific job to do, and they have a regulatory strategy which allows them to do the job that they are required to do, which is ensure that the training organisations they regulate deliver quality training and assessment. And as part of their regulatory strategy is that they conduct audits, because obviously they want to actually be convinced and go into organisations and confirm that you're not just saying you're doing the right thing, you are actually doing it, and that the students that you are servicing actually come out from your organisation with qualifications that are relevant to the industry in which they will be working, and meet the requirements of the training packages that you are offering to deliver to them. So it's really important that that TAC keeps monitoring what you're doing, so that everybody is absolutely confident that the training and assessment being delivered meets the requirements, and that the students actually are fit for and ready for the workplace. So, as I say, TAC uses the audit systems to ensure that their regulatory strategies are enforced, and that they can identify any issues that may be occurring. Sometimes it's systemic issues or lack of understanding across RTOs. Often it's specific to certain organisations, but the main thing is that whatever audits are conducted on behalf of TAC, they meet that definition, which is that they are planned, that they are systematic, and that the audit process is documented, and that will allow the auditor to justify any decisions made as a result of the audit, but also allow the RTO to fully understand what's being looked at and what the outcomes are, and how to improve if there are improvements to be made, and to ensure that they are continuing to offer quality training and assessment. It's a really important part of the TAC regulatory strategy, and is proving to be of value to both TAC in determining that their RTOs are compliant, but also is proving to be useful for the RTOs themselves. So Any audit that TAC runs has a certain number of objectives, and those primary objectives are really to establish whether the RTO, or if it's an applicant wishing to become an RTO, that they are meeting, first of all, the standards for RTOs 2015, the requirements of any training package, and the training products that they're actually intending to deliver or are delivering. And obviously, the really important thing is that whatever you as an RTO are doing, that you are responding to the needs of the learners that you are trying to engage with. There's no point in you having a marvelous training and assessment system which is not relevant to the students that you are actually targeting. I know one anecdotal example some time ago was an RTO who were offering training to roustabouts up in the Pilbara, but they were doing it online. Well, I don't know, perhaps I hope it goes without saying that that's probably not the best delivery approach, because I doubt very much whether many people in the middle of the Pilbara, when they're doing their roustabout work, are accessing computers. But that was a classic example of the training was fantastic, but they completely got it wrong in terms of understanding their students. So it really is important, and that's one of the very first things that as an RTO you should be taking into consideration when you start delivering training. So that's the objective, to make sure that all the RTOs that are registered with TAC are actually delivering quality training. And any audit that is conducted on TAC's behalf, so all the auditors that TAC engages, we have to adhere to the principles of auditing. And these are pretty common, but they are also, we look at them in regard to the specifics when it comes to auditing training organisations against the standards for RTOs. So the first principle, which we've talked about already, is that an audit must be systematic. We, as auditors, and TAC as the regulatory body, need to be sure that the audits are conducted in a systematic manner, and that the sampling that's conducted is relevant, and that we get it gives us the best opportunity to get a really good understanding of what you as an organization are all about. And if we can get that really good picture, then we can make sure that the conclusions that we draw and recommendations that we make are accurate, because we've conducted the audit systematically, and that we are, and therefore we are confident that we've covered all aspects of the area that we're actually investigating. So the very first principle is systematic, to be systematic. One of the other things with TAC in particular, and the standards for RTOs really, is that any audit should be outcomes focused. So what does that mean? That means what we're looking at when we come into one of your organizations is that we're not looking for you to be doing the things exactly the same way as every other RTO. That doesn't work. That's never been the case. We want to see what the outcomes of the way in which you implement your training and assessment are. We want to make sure that your students are actually walking out the doors with the skills they need, that you're managing the records correctly, that your trainers and assessors are all up to scratch and giving the students the best opportunity to get the knowledge and skills that they need. So we want to just look at the outcomes. We're looking at the way in which you implement the strategies that you've decided on, and make sure that the outcomes are actually what is required by the standards. So really, it's very important to remember that the auditor shouldn't and will not be coming in with preconceived ideas about how you do business, just so that you are actually producing quality outcomes at the end of whichever way you decide to run your organization. So there most definitely is not a one-size-fits-all, and that's why 90% of the time when you ask a very specific question about templates or tools or example documents, you'll probably get a bit of a slightly less specific response, because we don't want to dictate to you how you run your business. You need to work that out for yourselves with guidance, but you know, you're all unique individual organizations, and we want you to do the best for your staff and your students. So also when we there is a bit of a difference between the way in which we look at the outcomes for existing organizations when we come in to see whether or not you're still complying with the requirements of, say, for a re-registration audit, or whether you are a new organization and applying to become an RTO. And obviously there, all we can do is look at what you intend to do and hope that the outcomes that you are striving for will actually be possible. And we have to make a bit of a judgment and a bit of a crystal ball gazing activity when it's an application for an RTO. But generally speaking, we can get a good feel from the evidence that you provide whether or not the likelihood is that you will actually be able to implement and deliver the training and assessment that you are hoping to provide, and it will be a quality training organisation. The other thing, the other principle of auditing for TAC is that it's evidence-based. So whether it's a desk audit or whether it's a site visit, everything that you want or the evidence that you need to provide the auditor needs to be supporting your claims that you are running an organisation that delivers quality training and assessment. It's all very well and good to sit and say we're marvellous and we do this and we do that and we're a great organisation, and you can talk to the auditor as much as you like, but at the end of the day, the auditor will need evidence to support all the claims that you're making about how you're running your organisation and how you're delivering training and assessment. Yes, it's obviously really important that the auditor understands how all of this fits into your oops, sorry, my screen just died. What your organisation does and how you intend to manage the implementation of your training and assessment. But ultimately, the auditor can only make a decision on whether you're compliant or not based on the evidence that you provide. And in many ways, like if you're doing assessments when it comes to training and assessing, the evidence that you gather to make a competency decision is very similar in principle to the evidence that needs to be gathered to make a decision about an audit. So it really needs any evidence that's provided by you to the auditor to make a decision of compliance needs to meet the rules of evidence. So is the evidence valid? Is it actually, if you're telling me you're delivering training and assessment, is the documentation you're providing me relevant to the training and assessment you're actually saying that you're going to deliver? Sometimes we get documentation, particularly when training products have been superseded, and we get documentation that still harps back to the old units of competency. Well, it's not. That means it's not actually valid. It's not telling us how you are implementing the new and current training and assessment. So it needs to be something that is valid. It reflects the requirements, particularly something like the training package or the standards, and it should be quite clear that and give sufficient. There should be sufficient evidence for the auditor to be able to say yes, that information is valid. Also, is the evidence sufficient? This is how long's a piece of string, but it's a judgment that you and the auditor need to make, and it's about saying, am I truly providing enough information so that auditor can make a fair decision about how we are running our organisation? While you shouldn't swamp the trainer, the assessor, the auditor with too much information, especially anything that's not really relevant, do make sure and give yourself an ample opportunity to demonstrate compliance by giving them as much information as you can find, and then they can decide for themselves whether or not you're actually providing sufficient information. Often, if the auditor is not quite convinced about something, they will engage you and ask for more evidence maybe, and sometimes it's those sort of conversations that triggers in your memory that you've got other information that would be suitable for the auditor to look at. But try in your planning process to make sure you've got as much as you can to support any of the claims that you make about how you run your organisation. Also, one of the rules of evidence is that the evidence must be authentic. So is it genuine? Is it real? Is it actually reflecting what you do? You know, I have seen, particularly in audits where people are applying to become RTOs, where they've purchased management systems off the internet or got consultants in to give them a standardized documentation that really doesn't relate to the practice, the size of the RTO that they're going to set up or how they're intending to practice. So it's really, really important that the evidence that you give really reflects how you are running or intend to run your organization based on the needs of your clients, on the training products that you're going to be delivering. Don't, you know, it's not just good enough to present generic documentation, because that doesn't really tell the auditor that you understand what you're supposed to be doing, or that to give them confidence that you're actually going to be doing it in the right way. And finally, like all other evidence, it needs to be current. There's no point in providing reams and reams of documentation for training that you implemented years ago, particularly if you have revised that training or there are new training products. The auditor wants to see what you're doing now, what is current, what your policies and procedures are now, how you implement them now. Yes, if there are some issues, they might want to go back and look at some previous records, but generally speaking, there's not much value in looking at documentation about, say, the implementation of a qualification that's completely changed, or an implementation of a qualification where you as an RTO have identified issues and have revised that training and assessment. Yes, they want to see that if there weren't any major issues, that you've talked to the students and maybe done some supplementary training. But 90% of the time, what they want to see as an auditor is that it's information that's current about how you are doing business at the time of audit. Often, the most often cause of non-compliances is that there really isn't enough evidence provided for the auditor to make a judgment, and that is a shame, because 99% of the time the evidence is there somewhere, and that's why a site visit is usually very good, because the auditor can prompt and ask more questions. A desk audit, that can be done as well, but the onus is a lot more on you to think about how much evidence can I give this auditor to show that we are doing the right thing. And one of the best ways of doing that is to conduct some sort of internal pre-audit assessment, so some sort of self-assessment before you even make the application for either a change of scope or your re-registration, so that you are confident that you've got all the information that you need so that you can pass that on to the auditor. Another principle of auditing is that, and again, this is very relevant to auditors auditing for TAC, is that we must make the audit process as flexible as possible. As I said, no two RTOs are exactly the same, so no cohort of students are exactly the same. So we as an auditor, when we come into an organisation or gather evidence from an organisation, have got to understand that not one size fits all, and that we are flexible in the way in which we accept the evidence that is being presented to us. Sometimes we do need to delve more deeply into your processes, and that's where the auditor can try and extract information from you to make sure that they get a true and full picture of what is going on within your organisation. And that's why the auditor must accept that they've got to be flexible. And also sometimes what is provided in an audit throws up other issues, and the auditor may want to explore some other issues that weren't necessarily initially on the scope of the audit as such. Also, another principle of auditing is about continuous improvement. And I think anybody that's been working with TAC for any length of time knows that that is their key driver. They are really focused on helping the RTOs that they regulate to continuously improve the processes and policies and training and assessment that they deliver, and strive towards excellence. And I think the improvements that have been made over the years with the RTOs that I've seen is just amazing. And obviously TAC is doing everything they can to support you in that endeavour. These webinars, the fact sheets, the website information, all of that is being provided by TAC so that you can continually improve what you are offering. So, and I think the other important thing to consider in this part of, or principle of auditing, is that we audit against standards that are the baseline. They are the basic requirement. That doesn't mean to say you can't do much better. As long as you remain true to the actual requirements, you can improve your training and assessment all the time. And while TAC doesn't expect perfection, it does expect to see that you as an organisation are striving continuously for to maintain your quality training and assessment and your compliance with the standards for RTOs. And there are often times during audits, whether it's a desktop audit or even a site visit, or particularly a site visit, where auditors might say, right, you're meeting the requirements for a specific aspect of the training and assessment, or you're delivering. Sorry, my screen keeps disappearing on me. Whoops. But they will say, well, yes, you're doing the right thing, but here are some suggestions for opportunities for improvement, and they will actually also be listed, generally speaking, in the audit report. You don't have to take those on board, but it's obviously something that the auditors think would assist you in achieving your aim for delivering quality training and assessment. So it's usually worth listening to. But you don't have to implement any of those suggestions that are provided by the auditor. So that's those are the principles of the auditing process. And the final one is that every audit must be fair, open, and transparent. What that means is that we are not coming into your organisation as auditors to try and catch you out. We are trying to make the audit process as transparent as possible. Nothing is hidden. We are telling you from the very beginning what we're coming in to look at. We've given you the standards that we are going to be auditing you against. And it's really important that you then understand everything that we have provided for you, so that you can make sure that the evidence that you give us actually demonstrates that you're meeting the requirements. The other thing to remember is that the auditor will be speaking to you, particularly in a site audit, for quite a long time, and there'll be a lot of things discussed. And it's really important that you take time to say, hang on a minute, I don't quite get what you're saying there. It is never inappropriate for you to go back to the auditor and say, can you just explain that again? Or can you just describe again what you think might be the issue? Give me another opportunity to provide further evidence. So all the time you need to be engaged with the audit process, and that's the same with the desktop audit. If there are any issues, the auditor might come back to you for clarification, and you need to be engaged with that auditor when they ask those questions. Obviously, very occasionally, it doesn't happen very often, but very occasionally an RTO will complete an audit, the auditor will make their findings, and the RTO doesn't really agree with those findings, or that somehow the evidence that's been provided has been misinterpreted or misrepresented, and they feel that the audit outcome isn't actually a true reflection of where they stand as an RTO. There is a process that TAC has that allows you to appeal against any misrepresentation that you might feel may have occurred, and all this information can be found on the TAC website, but also your regulatory officer will be able to help you if that was the case. But as I say, I don't think this happens very often, because I think these days the TAC auditors and TAC secretariat are very conscious that we want to make sure that you are given every opportunity to demonstrate how well you as an organisation are running. Okay. Don't forget you can ask questions. I notice there's lots of issues around how to actually get onto the webinar, which is a shame. Okay, well, I hope that you're all managing it. If not, there will be a recording. All right. Okay. So we've talked about the basics of auditing and given you some background information, but I think now we need to look at exactly why TAC actually audits you and your organisations on a regular basis. There are a number of different types of audits that TAC conducts, and that will very much depend on what the outcome is supposed to be. That handout that I've given you does describe the categories of audits in more detail than I will go through now. So if you want to reference it later on, you can have a look at it at your leisure. Sorry, I was just looking at see if there are any questions though. But basically the audits that TAC conducts are divided into two sections, or two categories really. Those that are initiated by you as the RTO. So those are things which are audits that are that result from maybe you've put in an application, so either an application for initial registration or an amendment to scope of your current RTO, or renewal of registration. These days the registration periods are for up to 7 years for existing RTOs, or it could be a renewal of registration for an RTO that was granted initial registration and they only have a 2-year registration period. And again, it's initial registration request required, but it's to demonstrate that in the first 2 years of operation you're actually delivering what you promised during the initial registration audit. So basically, when you're asking TAC to come into your organisation to conduct an audit, they will be looking at your organisation in order to determine whether or not you are meeting the requirements. Sometimes when you submit an application for either amendment scope or even re-registration, sometimes TAC will also do a risk assessment and say, well, do we actually really need to go in and audit this particular organisation? And there are a number of factors which you can look at and check up on yourself in the TAC risk framework, and that's what they use to determine whether or not they will come in and do an audit if you submit an application of any kind. You will find that there are quite a few RTOs with good reputations that have been consistently seen to be compliant, that if you submit an application to change your scope, say for example, you won't be audited. They will just accept the evidence you've provided in support of the application, and they will go ahead and say, right, yes, we've granted you your change of scope. Same with re-registration. If you're a very low risk RTO, they might not initiate a site visit, or even may just do a cursory desktop audit. But it very much depends on the training products that you're delivering. Are they high risk? Have you as an organization had some issues in the past that they might want to double check on? But it's all defined by the TAC risk framework, which we actually provided you as part of some of the information that was submitted prior to the webinar. Excuse me. So there is also another webinar that will help you out with some of these issues. There is a recording available of another TAC presentation, which is about amending your scope of registration. So that's worth looking at if that's something that is likely to be happening with your organisation in the near future, and you can actually get some more detail about how that is going to be, how you can face those challenges and what you can do to manage that in order to get your change of scope application through. That webinar is actually on the TAC website. So those are the audits that are initiated by you as the RTO, and then there are those that are initiated by TAC, and these are slightly different, and they have a slightly different feel because they're usually as a response to some sort of issue identified either with you or with a generic across the board issues that are to do with strategic issues that have been identified by TAC. So there are various different audits. Yeah, so Mel's actually put up where you can get that particular recording of managing and amending RTO scope, so you can have, if you want to access that at any stage. So if TAC decides that they want to come in and audit, there are various types of audit that they might conduct, and these are initiated because of different criteria. So first of all, it might be a monitoring audit. So a monitoring audit, it's usually where something in the past has occurred and TAC wants to come in and just double check that things are running smoothly, or to double check that there are any issues surrounding specific training products or standards are being managed correctly. It's often, as I say, triggered by some findings from previous audits, and they want to double check that this is actually, what you said you were going to do when you've rectified issues, that you're actually doing that and that you haven't slipped into bad habits. Often it's also in areas of high risk where where industry and TAC have decided that the RTO is delivering those sort of high risk training products need to be monitored a bit more carefully. So they might decide to do a monitoring audit just to make sure everything is running smoothly. Obviously, there are also audits that are triggered by complaints from external agencies or individuals against an RTO, and TAC has a very clear and straightforward process for this. They manage any complaints. They make the first decision as to whether or not the complaint can be substantiated. If it is, and there is an issue that they've identified, then they will probably come in and look at the way your organisation is running. Usually the complaints are very specific, to different standards or different training products, and they are very focused on what the specific problem is that has been raised by the complainant. The process, as I say, is very clear, and it's on the TAC website should you ever need it, and they've got the policies, the complaints policy there, for either those of you that want to make a complaint about another RTO, or give you an understanding if somebody's made a complaint about your organisation, and that will give you an understanding of how it's going to be handled. But TAC will come in and probably do a very targeted audit. Then there are strategic industry audits, which these are usually triggered by some issues identified, usually by industry, or by the analysis that TAC conducts on the audits that they've conducted over the previous years to see if there are any systemic issues surrounding the implementation of training and assessment across the RTOs that they manage. They're not usually specific to RTOs, so a whole bunch of RTOs might be selected to be reviewed as part of a strategic industry audit, but it is no reflection necessarily on the RTO itself. They just want to come in and get a good feel for how a variety of RTOs are implementing certain aspects of the standards or training products. They're currently in the process of conducting a strategic industry audit around community services qualifications. And for obvious reasons, there have been a lot of focus on the delivery of community service training products over the past few months and years, particularly with COVID. And they've decided that they want to look at a sample of RTOs that are doing those training products and make sure there are no systemic issues that that need to be addressed and the support that TAC might need to give RTOs to make sure that they are addressed. They've conducted strategic reviews over the years on many areas. Most recently, they were looking at third-party arrangements. There were audits conducted on those RTOs that had identified they had third-party arrangements. There was one that was conducted on marketing and governance some time ago, and then a couple of years ago, they did one on high-risk work license training products and how they were implemented. Again, that was one of the ones that was initiated by industry. Safe Work was interested to see how the RTOs were implementing the high-risk work license units of competency, and TAC took that on board and conducted that strategic industry review, which was very valuable. And you can look up the results of all of those on the TAC website. Yeah, Mel's just given you a link to those strategic reviews. And finally, if the other type of audit that TAC might conduct and initiate themselves is a compliance monitoring audit. And it's usually about checking up on any issues that were identified in a previous audit, or if there were sanctions imposed after a previous audit. A compliance monitoring audit is usually conducted before those sanctions are removed, and it's really about making sure that the RTO that had issues is now systematically improving their delivery and implementing all the things that they identified as being required to address the non-compliances that were identified during the audit. So again, TAC decides when they're going to come in and do this, and it's a slightly different feel to the audits where you've invited TAC in to support an application. If there are any questions, please do feel free to add them in the chat box. Nothing yet. And Mel's doing a great job of providing you with all those links to the places where all the tools and templates that I'm talking about. Okay, so we've talked about the types of audits, and the other thing that is usually decided by TAC when it comes to determining or when it comes to auditing, TAC will be the one that will decide the scope of any audit that is going to be conducted. It will very much depend on the purpose of the audit, but you will be informed at the beginning of the audit process of exactly what the scope of the audit will be. Quite often, if it's a re-registration audit, maybe TAC won't look at every training product you have on offer. They will take samples. Same with the qualifications. They won't look at the implementation of every unit of competency. They usually sample 2 units from each qualification. So they will tell you what they're intending to look at, what the scope of registration will be, so that you are absolutely clear about what evidence you need to gather in order to prepare yourself for that audit. Very occasionally, an auditor might find some issues that they think could be systemic and want to look at some either other units of competency or maybe other training products, but that's not that. But that doesn't happen that often. So the scope, once the scope of registration has been decided, you'll be informed, and then you can get ready for and start preparing for the audit that is going to occur, either as a desk audit or a site visit. So having decided that there's going to be an audit, then obviously there are 2 methods of audit. I've already referred to some of those in passing. So you've got the desk audit, which is conducted by the auditor all on their own in their office, looking at documentation to support, say, an application for a change of scope. It's very much a desktop audit, which is looking at evidence that is provided by the RTO for review at the auditor's discretion on their own. They generally, if there are any issues or questions, they get back to you, but generally speaking, it's all done by the auditor without much consultation with you. And obviously the other type of audit, which is much more comprehensive, is a site audit. And the site audit is generally triggered for initial registration, re-registration, or if it's a major change to scope, maybe a change of scope. But a site audit is a much more comprehensive and complex audit process. Once TAC has decided that they are going to conduct an audit, they will inform you of the type of audit, they'll inform you of the scope of the audit, and they will also inform you of who your auditor is going to be. Most of the time, the audit team is the one individual, the one auditor. Very occasionally, if it's one of the very large organisations, for example, some of the TAFEs, when they get audited, there are a number of us that go in and audit specific areas which are allocated to the individual supporting auditors, but there's always a lead auditor, and you will be informed of who that lead auditor is going to be, and then it's up to you to say yes or no if there is any conflict of interest you perceive. But generally speaking, you will be informed that that's the auditor that will be conducting your audit, and they will be the people that you will be liaising with once the go-ahead is received to start the audit process. Sometimes the auditor, if they're coming to a site audit, will be joined by an observer, and that's most often when there could be some issues, or particularly if an RTO is being run out of a private residence. If that's the case, then it's perceived as a slightly more high-risk situation for the auditor, and the observer will come in. They're usually somebody from the Secretariat, but the important thing to remember is they don't actually play any part in the audit. They're just there to be an observer of what is going on in case there are any issues, and they sometimes are there if it's a controversial audit as well. Very occasionally, observers are there to actually look at the auditor themselves and performance manage the auditor. Or if it's somebody new that's coming to the audit panel, they will come and observe an established auditor to see how they conduct the audits. And finally, in this section about how TAC uses its audits, there's an important discussion to be had about consultants. Consultants can be a blessing and can be a nuisance. You have to be very careful about your choice of consultants and make sure that the information that they're providing is actually true and accurate for a start. But when it comes to preparing for an audit, yes, a lot of RTOs do go back to consultants and say, can you give me a hand? And 90% of them are pretty good. However, what you must understand and what they must understand is that while they can help you prepare for an audit, they cannot participate actively in the audit. So if they've given you documentation, they've prepared materials for you, they've done, got your documentation together and helped you with how you are actually going to submit your evidence and what evidence is to be submitted, they must then take a back seat during the actual audit process, because the auditor wants to know that those of you that are running the RTO actually understand what you're presenting as evidence, as in terms of your compliance for the requirements of the standards or the training packages. So if a consultant is only engaged for a one-off activity, as I say, they cannot participate in the audit process. They can be there, but they mustn't actually contribute. The only exception to this is if you've got a consultant who's embedded in your organization and that you have an ongoing contact with that consultant for assistance and continuous improvement and compliance management, whatever it is. But you will have to demonstrate and provide evidence to the auditor that they are really effectively part of your team. But again, the auditor will want to know that it's not just the consultant that's across everything that's going on in your RTO. They will want to know that you and your trainers and assessors and your administrators understand the requirements that are and understand the evidence that has to be provided for audit and understand how they contribute to the outcome of the audit and the delivery of training and assessment. So be aware there are some issues around consultants that can make life a little bit difficult. The other thing to be aware of is that actually quite a lot of the auditors that audit for TAC are consultants, act as consultants as well. So you might well see a TAC auditor sitting in with a TAC audit, which is challenging. But yeah, it's at least you're getting good advice there. Okay. Any questions? No, still no questions. Okay. So, for whatever reason, you've got an audit coming up. Either you've initiated it yourself as a change of scope or re-registration, or you're asking for an initial registration audit because you want to become an RTO, but whatever the situation is, an audit has been decided and initiated. So most of the time, the preparation or the preparation prior to a site audit is significantly more complicated than the preparation for a desktop audit. The desktop audits are pretty straightforward. You've got to submit certain evidence with your application, usually for a change of scope, and the letter that you receive from TAC will give you all the information that you require, and the auditor will get in touch if there are any other issues. So that's pretty straightforward, and you'll be given a time frame in the information that provided by TAC. When it comes to a site audit, obviously there are a lot more ducks to get in a row. You've got to get the auditor there at a certain date. The RTO's got to be ready for the audit. Everybody's got to be clear about what is to be audited, what their roles and responsibilities are, etc., etc. So it is a little bit more challenging. There are two flowcharts. Again, that's the documentation that you were provided with prior to this the presentation, that gives you a bit of a flowchart as to how both a desktop audit and a site audit are conducted. It gives you the timeframes and things as well, which are very useful. So it's worth having a look at those if you are going to be involved in either a desktop or a site audit. So it's worth having just to double check what the requirements are and what the timeframes are in terms of how quickly the TAC and the auditors have to organise the audit for you and make sure that you're ready for the audit as well. So when it comes to scheduling a site audit, as with a desk audit, TAC will inform you of which auditor is going to be your chief auditor, your main auditor, your lead auditor. There are situations where, for various reasons, the auditor chosen by TAC may not be suitable because there's a conflict of interest. Doesn't happen that often, but very occasionally it does. Often because that auditor may have supported your organisation in the past as a consultant, or they have some other conflict of interest in regard to, say, the training packages being delivered, etc. So it's up to you, if you are informed of an auditor that you think there might be a conflict of interest, to go back and give them an explanation of why that shouldn't is to be considered for conducting the audit that on your RTO. It doesn't mean that you can just say that I don't like that auditor. You've actually got to have a valid reason for it, and the onus is also on the auditor to say, hang on a minute, thanks very much, that RTO is great, but I've actually got a conflict of interest with them for various reasons, and they have to tell TAC about that as soon as the audit is allocated to them. So there could be various reasons why there's a conflict of interest, but be aware that you need to declare that at the very beginning of this process once you're informed who the auditor is going to be. And to be absolutely clear, when a conflict of interest, particularly with auditors who are consultants, the auditor must not have had any real contact with your organisation for the previous 6 months. And it also applies at the other end of the audit. Once an auditor has audited your organisation and the audit is complete, that auditor cannot you cannot engage that auditor for at least 6 months if you wanted them to come and assist you with any other issues in your organisation. So there's that 6 month before and after gap, which is what any breach of that is regarded as a conflict of interest. Obviously, we as auditors are very engaged in the education program that TAC is providing, as of today. And because I've delivered this webinar on auditing, doesn't mean to say you would then have a conflict of interest with me, because the information I'm giving you is not specific to your RTO. It's generic information which is out there, and therefore any of the auditors that you see delivering the webinars or workshops for TAC there is no conflict of interest with them if they are then chosen to audit your organisation. But just be aware of that. As long as it's information which is publicly available, it's not a problem. Obviously, sometimes things happen. Emergencies happen, people get sick, change of circumstance. The most important thing, if there is any reason why either TAC or you as the RTO need to reschedule or cancel an audit, cancel the audit. Sorry, I'll just get a glass of water. That cancellation or rescheduling needs to be done in a timely manner. TAC is very, very good at this. They want to minimize the disruption to you as an organization. They don't want to disadvantage you by stringing out the process, re-registration process or change of scope process, so they'll try and manage it very quickly. And they are aware that, you know, often changes of scope are in response to specific industry requirements, and it can cost an RTO time and money if they aren't able to start delivering the training to meet the industry requirement that was identified. Generally speaking, for a site audit, the auditors will contact you and try and agree a mutually suitable date and time. But and if it really can't, if that really can't be determined between you and the auditor directly, TAC will actually then intervene and either decide on a date or maybe even allocate a different auditor if the time issues can't be resolved. Obviously, there are also emergencies. You know, people get sick, the auditors get sick, all sorts of things can happen. But the most important thing to remember, as soon as you think there's going to be an issue, you must contact TAC straight away. Same with the auditors, they will contact TAC as soon as there might be an issue. And then TAC, the Secretariat, the staff at the Secretariat will try and resolve the issues around rescheduling. If you are cancelling an audit, sometimes, unless there's a very, very good reason, you might still be charged for that audit. So it's something that you shouldn't take lightly. It's something that needs to be considered before you actually think about trying to cancel an audit altogether. I did briefly touch on auditing site audits which are conducted in private residences. This happens actually quite more often than you would think. There are quite a few RTOs who really have no office presence as such. They conduct all their training and assessment on site, usually for specific clients, and there is absolutely no need for them to have an office in Perth or wherever, and they quite often run out of their own private residences in home offices, and that's quite acceptable. But if the auditor has to attend a private residence, it is a bit more of a risk to both the auditor and the staff of the RTO. So it is something that needs to be you need to inform TAC immediately that that is where the audit is going to be conducted, and then TAC can carry out any sort of risk mitigation that they feel is necessary, which is most often asking one of the TAC Secretariat staff to come in as an observer and accompany the auditor there. It's really important that also when you're preparing for a site visit that you're upfront with both TAC and the auditor about any special requirements there might be. Say you deliver on different sites, you need to make sure that you've got permission from those sites for the auditor to come on and see the training and assessment. You need to make sure that if the auditor needs to have any personal protective equipment, that you tell them about it. You need to tell them about any other very specific issues that might be affecting how the audit can be conducted, even something as simple as where the auditor can park, because they need to know how much time they've got to allocate to, say, finding a parking space or walking to the RTO in order to conduct the audit. So just be upfront with any issues that you may think of, and the auditor will be more than grateful if you can inform them of that prior to the audit actually going ahead. And very, very occasionally, an RTO will schedule in an audit, be it a change of scope or even a re-registration audit. And then after that audit has been allocated and is ready to go, they will decide that they want to either change the scope of the audit, as in maybe remove one of the training products or even add a training product. That can be done as long as there is sufficient notice and that it is not changing the the scope of the audit fundamentally. So if it's a completely different industry area, then probably that wouldn't run. But if it can be easily accommodated, TAC will try and accommodate any such changes, but you do need to make sure that both the auditor and the TAC secretary are aware of those changes that are required. Okay. So, as I say, any other questions, please let me know. But otherwise, how are we doing? Well, so we've got another 50 minutes to go on this. So I'll start looking more at some of the specific things relating to how to prepare for a TAC audit. Obviously, we've already been talking about the evidence that you are going to submit to demonstrate that you are compliant with the requirements of the standards and that your training and assessment meets the requirements of the training package and training product that you are delivering. It is the only way that you are going to demonstrate to the auditor that your processes, your implementation is compliant. So it's really important that you take time prior to an audit to sit down and think about exactly what you want to give the auditor in terms of evidence to demonstrate that you are doing the right thing. Quite often, TAC now, again, because they are supporting RTO so much more, will will provide you with guides on what sort of evidence should be submitted. Sometimes they're in fact sheets. There are also specific guides about what evidence is needed for applications, etc., and they're worth looking at and double checking. So, and that will give you a really good idea of what documentation, what evidence, what other evidence you need to provide in order to demonstrate that you're meeting the requirements of the compliance requirements related to your RTO's operation. In order to do that, you have got to be absolutely across all the requirements of the standards, all the requirements of the training products. So it's really important that you take that time to familiarize yourself with what is needed for your organization to be effective. And it's particularly important for re-registration audits or initial registration audits that you are familiar with all the standards. For changes of scope, the focus is mainly on standard 1 and standard 5, but even so you need to be across the requirements that your organization needs to address. So there are various guides that TAC produces, and those are really useful documents, depending on whether it's an amendment to registration or initial or renewal of registration. That gives you some information about what they expect us to be looking at when we go in for auditing. Obviously, the lists are not exhaustive. They are, as I've said before, every RTO is slightly different. They're also not prescriptive. If you haven't got some documents, well, you need to explain why they are. It may not be applicable to the way you operate. So be very open and honest with the auditor. But what is not a good excuse is that you didn't understand or didn't know that you were required to have this information. You should be sufficiently across the requirements to make sure that you're covering all aspects and providing sufficient evidence to demonstrate compliance. I think I've briefly said one of the best ways to help an auditor and also to make them feel, warm and fuzzy is to assist them with the information regarding the evidence that you're going to be submitting. When we look at the audit report, if we get a time, you will see that one of the first things the auditor has to do is list any evidence that has been cited in order to demonstrate compliance with the clauses of the standards that are being audited. So, one of the best ways you can help the auditor out is to give them a Word document with the, it's a table of some sort, maybe with the name of the document, accurate name of the document, how it assists in meeting the requirements of the standard, so that the auditor can then clearly see what they should be looking at. Also, it means they can cut and paste that list and they don't have to two-finger type like I do to reproduce the list that of evidence that you have provided. It's just a way of helping the auditor, but it's also a very good way for you to double check that you've got everything you need before the audit process starts. So it's a really, really good idea. So depending on the audit and the type of audit, whether it's desktop audit, site audit, or whether it's a an initial or re-registration audit or change of scope, you will need to compile different evidence to support your application. Generally speaking, when it's a desk audit, you will submit some evidence with your application that the auditor will be able to access that from the TAC portal. It's a bit clunky sometimes, but we can usually see what you've submitted. But also the auditor may well come back to you and ask for some additional information once they've been assigned the audit, specifically for the changes of scope of registration. Again, the more clear you are about what you've submitted and what the name of the documents are, the better. But the auditor is entitled to come back to you and say, can I see a little bit more, and also to clarify any issues that they might have. If there is, however, too much evidence that's still needed to be submitted, and that there's clearly a lack of understanding about what the requirements are, they may go straight, they may not come back to you again, because there's only so many times we can ask for the evidence that needs to be submitted in order to demonstrate your compliance. And that's why you need to be across this. It's really, really important that you know what you've got to submit. Okay. Right, so preparing for a desk audit, as I say, it's a reasonably straightforward process. You've got the list of evidence that you have to provide to support your application. The auditor will then get back to you if they need any additional information. They may also call you or email you to find out, to clarify certain things, and but there's usually no requirement for the auditor to do any physical inspection of your organization. But one thing I would advise, if you have got if your change of scope is for something that is pretty resource intensive or has some very specific resource requirements, it's often good to support your application with some photographs, say, of your kitchens or your workshops or the equipment that's needed for that specific training product that you're adding to your scope of registration. Don't assume that the auditor knows, just because you're a big organization, say a TAFE, that you know what equipment and what resources you have. You can't make any assumptions. The auditor can only make judgments on the information that you give them at the time of that particular audit. It doesn't matter if I've been to your organization 2 or 3 times beforehand. I cannot make assumptions about your say your fee structure or whatever from what I've seen in the past. I've got to be able to I've got to make a judgment on the evidence that you provide me for that specific audit. So don't assume that the auditor knows how well equipped you are. That's not they can't make those assumptions. You might have sold everything, there's all sorts of reasons why that may no longer be current or appropriate or valid. So that you need to really follow up on any of the resourcing issues, and make sure that you give the auditor every chance to say yes, that organization's got everything that's needed. And a video or a pictures of resourcing are always very, very useful. So it's really important, as I say, that you understand that each audit is really a standalone activity and there's no carryover from previous audits. So the auditor will contact you as required, and then they will then go ahead and conduct the audit itself, draft the audit report and submit it to TAC, and you will then get informed of the outcome of that audit. And we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Okay, so yep, desktop audit, reasonably straightforward. Site audits are, as we've said before, are a bit more complicated. However, it's still the same principle. You must be across everything that is needed to demonstrate that you as an organisation are compliant with the requirements of the standards and also the requirements of the training package. You need to be informed. And one of the best ways of doing that is to conduct some sort of self-assessment. And generally speaking, I would suggest you do that before you even make your application. Bear in mind that the auditors will be looking at your organisation alone. They are only looking at what you are doing as an organisation. No two RTOs are exactly the same. No two RTOs have business practices that are exactly the same. And that's why the auditor is flexible. The auditor understands that the evidence provided will be specific to you, not necessarily generic information that can be acquired elsewhere, because what they want to see is how you are operating, not how good you are at copying and pasting other people's documentation. As I say, conduct your self-assessment. Make sure that you highlight any issues that you think need to be addressed before the audit is initiated. It is far better for you as an organisation to have identified any issues that are likely to cause a non-compliance than for the auditor to come in and identify things that you're not aware of. You know, if you honestly believe your organisation is 100% compliant, doing everything right, and the auditor comes in and finds some major issues, that is going to throw up all sorts of other questions in the auditor's mind. If you are honest and say, look, we've conducted the self-assessment, we found a few issues, we've made some changes, we have got a continuous improvement plan, all of that will contribute to the auditor's decision-making process as to whether or not any non-compliances that they then identify are major or can be deemed to be relatively minor because they're already being addressed. Okay. So conduct your self-assessment, be honest with yourselves. There's no point in hiding if things aren't quite right, because, as I say, auditors have this sort of sixth sense where they seem to find, if there's one assessment that's been conducted that wasn't quite right out of about 20, you'll find that the auditor will hone in on the one that's not quite right. So don't try and hide things, and make sure that it's much better if you've actually identified any issues yourself. Obviously, once a site audit has been scheduled, you need to decide on who you are going to get involved with that particular audit process. You need to identify the team that you are going to help you run the audit. The first thing is to identify an individual who's going to be your point of contact with the auditor. It's really good if that one person is the continuity, because it's the auditor will want to speak to one individual and determine confirm all the requirements with one individual. So the first thing to do is appoint a point of contact that the auditor can and inform the auditor they are the people that they are the individuals that you want them to deal with. Depending on the size of the audit, the organisation, the RTO, there may be a number of people in your audit team, particularly if you've got a lot of different training products that you deliver. If it's a really big organisation delivering training on multiple sites, you will need quite a big team to support you in that audit. If you're a one-man band, well, the decision is pretty easy. As I say, allocate a point of contact for the audit, but also if you've got a staff member who can be a note taker, it's a really, really good idea if you have somebody that sits in on the audit and jots down some of the things that the auditor says during the audit process. Quite often, things will be discussed during the audit and snippets of information will be shared that may not be included in an audit report, may not be discussed at the end of the audit process, but it's worth it if you've got a note taker there to jot things down. Also, it's worth them jotting down any areas that the auditor finds that might need rectification, so that you are can go through all of that at the end of the audit with the auditor and say, look, let's double check what we still need to do. And I understand, so that you've got a record of where you think there were issues identified. So it's really, really useful if you've got somebody that can be a note taker. That's really great. Obviously, when the auditor's on site, they'll probably do a few interviews. Usually it's if there are students available, they'll interview students. If there are trainers and assessors available, they usually interview some of the trainers and assessors, and if it's a big audit, those responsible for the administration of the RTO, so that they can get a good full picture of all the requirements, all the ways in which the your RTO meets the requirements of the standards. Do make sure that your team is fully briefed and that they know what their role is supposed to be. Make sure that you tell them that they need to be open and honest with the auditor. There's nothing worse than people not trying to hide things, because it never works. These things come out in the end. Also, the more you prepare your members of staff for the audit, the more at ease they will be during the audit process. If the audit is to be conducted across multiple work sites or training establishments, make sure that you've organised the schedule and that the auditor is aware of what the schedule, site visit schedule is going to be, and make sure that they are really made aware if they've got any PPE that they need to access, etc. Also, it's really important to allocate the auditor a decent workspace. I spread myself a lot during an audit, so it's always good for me to have a big table or desk. The other thing that I personally find really helpful is that, especially these days where a lot of the evidence provided by RTOs is electronic, if you've got one of those electronic whiteboards so that we can have it up on the whiteboard and discuss the documentation as we're going through it, that really does help. Obviously, small organisations, individuals, this may not be possible, but there needs to be somewhere for the auditor to be able to sit and gather the information and have time to themselves to think about what they are actually looking at and how, if there is any follow-up that they want to conduct during the course of that audit. So do allocate them somewhere to work. And make sure that any auditor is aware of any special circumstances, so where they can park, if there are access issues, etc., etc. Just make sure that you are open and upfront with the auditor about all of that. So that's the main body of the discussion I wanted to have with you today about preparing for the audit, because it is, the topic is preparation for an audit. But I think that, in summary, I just want to remind you that please think of an audit as an opportunity to showcase your organisation. It shouldn't be seen as an adversarial process. Auditors try very hard to make sure that that is not the case. We try to make it a good experience, and I would say that the feedback that TAC receives for most of its audits means that we are actually, as auditors, achieving that. Most people come away from an audit feeling that they've either learned something or that their organisation will be improved by the feedback that has been provided during the audit. The auditor's not trying to catch you out, but if you try and hide things, they will in their uncanny way quite often uncover things. Better to be open and honest about any issues that you have identified, and that will also give you an opportunity to say, look, we found this, but this is what we're already doing. Oh, this stupid thing. If you are thinking about the evidence you need to provide, if in doubt, have as much. It's better to have more evidence than not enough. However, make sure that that evidence is valid and applicable to the part of the audit that you are actually participating in. No, don't try and bury the auditor under information that isn't relevant, because that will just stop them actually conducting an effective audit. But make sure you have more rather than less evidence if you're at all unsure about what the auditor might want to see. And the biggest tip for keeping an auditor suite is to give them that list of evidence so that they can use that for their own purposes when it comes to writing the audit report. Okay. So there are lots of questions that are coming through about the supporting documentation for this and the other webinars. A lot of it is already, some of it was already provided with your registration for this webinar, but other stuff is available on the TAC website. It is a really useful place for you to investigate, and TAC is truly committed to supporting their RTOs to become, effective organizations delivering quality training and assessment. And and I often share what TAC provides with my clients who are actually registered with ASCO, because there is nothing that compares with the information that TAC provides you guys. Anyway, we've got about another half an hour or so, so I will briefly touch on what actually happens during an audit, so during the site audit. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here because it's the main focus of this particular webinar was on how to prepare for your audit. But the biggest thing to remember if you are having a site audit is be prepared. Do as much preparation as you can beforehand, all the things I've talked about. You will then feel much more confident when you sit face to face with the auditor. You'll be sure that you've got everything as ready as it can be, and then the audit will go much more smoothly. There is a standard format that the auditor is required to follow when it comes to a site audit. The first thing at the beginning of the day is the entry meeting. So try and have as many people as you can at the entry meeting. It's really important that senior management is at these meetings, the entry and the exit interviews. But it's an opportunity, first of all, for the auditor to be introduced to everybody that they're likely to be coming across during the course of the audit. Gives those people an opportunity to meet the auditor and hopefully allay some of their fears about being audited. Excuse me. And it's also the point at which the auditor double checks that everybody's on the same page when it comes to what's actually going to be covered by the audit. So what qualifications are going to be, or training products are going to be looked at, what standards and clauses are going to be looked at, and that the other thing that they usually remind the people of at the entry meeting is if there are any other issues they identify, they can look at different things if the auditor feels that that might be a systemic issue that needs looking at. So they'll outline the audit process and the schedule, usually give a broad outline about what evidence they will be expecting to see. The auditor will also give you an indication of what the sorry, I'm just looking at the question. Sorry, explain what the possible findings might be, and then it will also give you or the main point of contact an opportunity to ask any questions. The management can give a brief overview of the organisation, which is also useful because the auditor has to write a summary at the beginning of the audit report. Sorry, there is a question. Okay, would it be fair to request where a key RTO staff member has annual leave booked prior to an audit date being issued to an RTO? What you're saying is to postpone an audit because the key staff member isn't going to be around. That's something you would have to discuss with your regulatory officer directly with TAC. Generally speaking, they, as I say, TAC is very accommodating, and you know the reality is that if that is a key individual, then the auditor is not going to get the evidence that they require to make a valid judgment on whether or not the RTO is compliant. So unless it's something, you know, it's going to blow out the time frame of your audit considerably, 99% of the time that should be able to be accommodated. It's especially if it's an audit initiated by you. However, if it is a complaint audit or one of the audits that TAC initiates, there may be less scope for change. But talk to you as RTOs registered regulated by TAC have this wonderful opportunity of talking to your regulatory officers. You cannot, you know, I cannot overstate how important that is for the relationship between you and TAC. So they're there to be asked. You've got Kane, who's the boss, who can also make decisions. You know, TAC is an organisation that tries to do the best by their regulators, the RTOs they regulate. So please don't hesitate to ask. The worst that will happen is they'll say no, but you will have a response. Yeah, yeah, exactly. You know, I think it is such a contrast with the other regulators. Anyway, enough with, you know, getting big-headed at this rate. Anyway, so the entry meeting is really about and it gives you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the RTO so that the auditor can get a better understanding of where you fit in the greater scheme of things, and it's also useful information for them to include on the initial part of the audit report. Obviously, the main part of the audit is collecting the evidence and reviewing the documents and conducting interviews and either with staff or students or clients. So that's the real, you know, where the rubber hits the road with the audit process. The main thing is to remember that it is your one and only opportunity to demonstrate your compliance. The auditor is not a clairvoyant. They can't make assumptions about evidence. They can't, you can tell them all you like about how you're intending to do this, that, and all the rest of it. If you haven't got the evidence to support that, the auditor can say, thank you very much, that's very interesting, but I can't make a judgment based on that. You've got to have the evidence to support what you are, you know, what you are doing, what you've done in the past, and that's what the auditor will need to see. And again, TAC does everything they can to assist you with what evidence should be. You've got the various guides, and I suggest you look those up prior to any audit. Okay. Obviously, you know, every auditor has sat in audits and seen good, bad, ugly. I have to say, generally speaking, I think all RTOs are getting much better at being able to meet the requirements of the standards and also to deliver quality training. I think the education process that TAC has been going through is paying dividends, but you still get some classic issues when you are an auditor. One of the things that I see most, I think, probably, is training and assessment strategies. Uh, we're all guilty of liking to buy a template for things, and I see certain organizations produce templates for strategies which are just tick and flick boxes. They are not the best way for you to, as an organization, to sell and to demonstrate the fact that you truly thought about how you're going to deliver your training and assessment. Your strategy needs to have enough detail to demonstrate that you've really thought about what you're going to be doing in terms of delivering the training assessment for your clients, for your students in your RTO. Make sure that your training and assessment strategy is telling the story you are trying to get over. There is a good fact sheet on this again from TAC, but make sure that your training and assessment strategy isn't some tick and flick box that tick and flick document that you've bought from a support organization that really doesn't tell your story. And the other often really glaringly obvious omission when it comes to evidence is every RTO usually has some mechanism for getting feedback from their students and the employees, even if it is only those feedback documents that you have to complete for your reporting process. But what happens is all this evidence is gathered and nothing is done with it. So you'll look at some of these feedback forms and there'll be a comment on there, and you say to the RTO, well, what did you do about this? Oh, well, no, we didn't really follow it up. That's really important. There's no point in gathering feedback from students, employers, whoever else, if you're not going to do something about the feedback that's provided. Sometimes it's not valid. Sometimes it's not an issue that you can deal with, or it's not going to be suitable for your organization. But do make sure you do have, provide evidence if you have followed up on that feedback. So they're just a few things where I, see quite often issues when I'm actually at an RTO. Finally, once all the evidence has been gathered, that you've had a sufficient opportunity to dazzle the auditor with how wonderful an organisation you are running, they will need some time to sit and think about how they, what they've seen, if there's any additional information that needs to be provided, or if they've given you an opportunity to do some quick rectification. Quite often, if it's something very minor, that you can do that straight away, and then they will make an initial decision about what the outcomes of that audit will be, and those will be then provided at the exit interview. It doesn't mean to say that that's necessarily exactly how the audit outcome will be written in the audit report. Very occasionally there's some other issues, but generally speaking, at the exit interview you will be given a very good idea of where the auditor has seen good practice, opportunities for improvement, and if appropriate, any areas of non-compliance and how serious those areas of non-compliance are. It will also be a chance for you as the auditees to ask questions again, clarify again what you think the requirements are, what you think that the outcome of the audit has been, and that you and the auditor are both on the same wavelength, because there's nothing worse than getting an audit report which is a surprise. It shouldn't happen, because the exit interview should cover everything, but use that opportunity of the exit interview to clarify any issues. Okay. So, very briefly, because we've only got another 10 minutes or so, after a TAC audit, the first thing, once the audit has gone away, they will go up, look at all the evidence that you've provided, make sure that the findings that and the conclusions that they've come to are reflect the evidence that's been provided, and they will start drafting the audit report. And remember, drafting the audit report, you read it and it's long-winded. It's a long-winded document. Drafting it is even more long-winded, and the more help you can give the auditor by giving them a list of the evidence that you've given them, the better. And it makes us all feel a lot. That makes the audit report process a lot less, audit report writing process a lot less painful. So they will go ahead and write the audit report, come to their conclusions. We don't make the final decision, we just recommend. The audit report will be developed on the TAC portal, and then we will submit that to the Secretariat for consideration. Depending on whether it's a fully compliant audit or whether it's minor or non-compliances, major or non-compliances, whatever the findings are, the council or the Secretariat will contact you and let you know what the outcome is and provide the audit report for your information. The most important part generally for the organisation being audited is the findings. There are basically a number of findings that can be documented in the audit report. First of all, the auditor is asked to say whether or not the overall outcome is compliant or non-compliant. They also are given an opportunity to identify any opportunities for improvement, OFIs, that were identified during the audit process, and they usually document those at the beginning of the audit report. They are not binding. If you want to take the advice that's provided, so be it. Nobody will audit you on those things, but generally speaking, there's something that would be worth considering for your continuous improvement aspects of your organisation. Occasionally, the auditor will also identify any strengths of your organisation. These have to be exceptional, but it does happen. There are some organisations out there that go way beyond the minimum requirements set by the standards for RTOs, and those are the ones that need to be acknowledged and are, and we try to do that as often as we can. Obviously, then the final part of the findings is the overall level of compliance or non-compliance. If the audit or the RTO has been found to be fully compliant, that's fine. You won't get much more detail than that. However, where there are non-compliances, the auditor will determine how severe those non-compliances are, and then the response of the Secretariat will be based on the level of non-compliance. And so basically, there could be minor non-compliances which can be easily rectified. Then there are significant non-compliances, which mean that there are issues with the training that impact the training and assessment that you're providing. However, they can be rectified relatively easily, and you will be given an opportunity. Usually it's a 20-day opportunity to make those changes and address those non-compliances. Then there are critical non-compliances, which really do impact on the training and assessment that's being delivered and the learners that have passed through the RTO, and those and the Secretariat or a TAC may decide that there are sanctions required to make sure that the RTO really does rectify the issues that have been addressed. And sometimes it means that going back and rectifying things that have happened in the past. And then there are critical non-compliances, which are so dangerous that there's a risk of injury or death to either the RTO staff or the students. And that's usually, if any of those have identified in fact, the auditor will generally stop the audit straight away. They won't even get to finish the audit. There is more detail on how to address the non-compliances. There is that fact sheet, so I don't want to labour the point now, but do be aware that there are specific timelines. The auditor's got 10 days to write the report. You will get the report, and then you will have 20 days to rectify. And then, and if the rectification is deemed to be sufficient, then you'll be given a positive outcome. Or if it's still not, if you're still non-compliant, then the RTO will, then TAC will decide whether or not they want to take it further and what recommendations they intend to make to the council. But this is all in that fact sheet that was provided today. Okay. If you are found to have non-compliances that are relatively easily addressed, you will be given that opportunity to provide additional evidence. Be very clear in what evidence you are providing and where you see that evidence addressing the non-compliance. Again, a table or some sort of summary for the auditor is really, really useful in that respect. The most important thing when you do get an audit where you have to respond and demonstrate you have rectified any issues that were identified, you really do need to take a systematic approach to dealing with those so that you are really clear about how you've addressed the issues the auditor has identified. 90% of the time that rectification evidence goes back to the same auditor, so they've got the bigger picture and what the reasoning was behind the non-compliances, and therefore will be better able to make a judgment as to whether the new evidence actually addresses the issues identified. But that's not always the case, so you need to make sure that you really give yourself a chance to demonstrate quite clearly how you've addressed the issues that have been included in the audit report. If you really feel that the audit report and the outcome of the audit is not fair and doesn't represent your operation as an RTO, there is an opportunity to dispute the findings. There's an appeals and complaints procedure, which again TAC has documented very, very clearly, and it's freely accessible on the TAC website. So we have got 8 minutes. If anybody has got any other questions, I know it's a bit hard when there are quite so many people listening to a webinar like this, but Mel has done a great job in pointing in the direction of the documents I've been referring to. Some of them were already provided with your registration confirmation for this particular webinar, but if you have got any other questions right now, no? I can't see anybody typing. Oh, hang on. It's been a big session. Yes, it has, hasn't it? Well, it's an hour less than it used to be, so thank you, lucky stars. You didn't have to listen to me anymore. Anyway, thank you very much for your responses. There are some useful references listed here. So the standards for RTOs, which should be your Bible. There's a user guide that TAC has produced, which is specific for TAC registered organisations. And then, as I say, all the fact sheets and things that you should be familiar with. They are absolutely amazing documents, and you know, a lot of hard work has gone into developing those. So take advantage of it. Thank you for listening to me. Sorry I was getting a bit croaky towards the end. It's been a while since I've talked for this long. Obviously, any questions that you have, you can contact TAC directly. You've got your regulatory officers that you can speak to, and you know, if there are any other questions, the secretariat can give you information, or you can even, you know, some requests can even go back to the auditors. Anyway, I look forward to seeing some of you at some of the audits I'm going to be conducting in the near future, and enjoy the rest of your day over in warm WA.